And welcome on into the latest edition of the Blue Horseshoe podcast. Ryan Hickey, George Bremer here with you. I am live from New York City. George is live from the Convention Center in Indianapolis at the Scouting Combine yet again as we are recording on Thursday afternoon. And George, you're wrapping up here. We had Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen both talk to the media, both talk to the Indy press specifically on Wednesday, and a lot to dive into. We heard quarterback traits, what Shane Steichen likes in a quarterback, what Chris Ballard likes in a quarterback. Any sort of hints of which quarterback maybe they're leaning towards. We'll discuss what they said and what could it actually mean. Also, too, as you are well aware, every Colts fan is well aware, the number one pick for the Bears is up for sale. We talked about it on the last pod. In case you missed it, check us out on the Blue Horseshoe Pod YouTube page or wherever you do get your podcasts. Look us up, the Blue Horseshoe Pod. Our pod's a little different, so make sure you look for the blue logo. That is where our brand new podcast feed is, wherever you get your podcast, Blue Horseshoe Pod with the blue logo. That's where you can find our last episode where we did kind of talk about the Colts having to trade up to number one, not being outbid, but we did hear Chris Ballard, especially specifically, talk about his mindset into trading up. So let's start there, George, because that's obviously, before we talk about which quarterbacks the Colts like and what traits they like, in order for them to get the quarterback they want, you have to be at number one. We talked about that a lot, and Chris Ballard was asked about that a lot on Wednesday, his philosophy of trading on up. And after hearing kind of him talk, you have a fear that you don't think the Colts are going to trade up to the number one. They will sit either at number 4 or number 3, but they won't be drafting number 1. Why is that?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I've been going back and forth on it too. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit off the air. Even, I think it's such a weird year. I think there's a lot of paralysis by analysis right now. And I feel like when I left the building last night, I felt like it was on a table. I felt like, my first
that they'll say at 4
on the way out
on the table that they're on 4. Okay.
That it was on a table that they will go up. That
okay.
Just because of some of the things that he'd said about, once they have the meeting, they haven't sat down with the coaches and gotten them involved yet. Once they have that meeting, if there's a guy there that they feel like they really want, they'll go up and get him. And so at that time I was saying that. Now, paralysis by analysis, you get into this afternoon, I'm kind of talking myself back the other way because of other things that he said. But the big one for me that was really sticking out, the very last thing he told us on the way out the door was that he said, we're going to get the best player in the draft. And somebody said, why? And he said, because we're at 4, and I really like where we're at number 4. To me, that means one of two things. One, maybe they're trading up. You're going to get the best player in the draft because you're going up to number 1. But he already said that wasn't on the cards right now. That's something that they're going to talk about later. The other thing, though, is that he just seemed very confident. And it makes me feel like there's a guy he really likes, maybe, that he feels like is going to be there at 4. And to me, that points to one of two guys, either Stroud or Richardson, just because they're guys that you could make a case would more likely be there at 4. But I don't know. And again, I think that's what makes this such an intriguing thing. I know everybody listening right now, some of them are probably really happy with this. Some of them would be very upset with this idea, but I think they've all got their own opinions too. And I think that's what makes this offseason so intriguing, is that there's just so much out there. And I think you could pick through that press conference that he did yesterday, the one that Shane Steichen did yesterday. I can find a quote to support all 4 guys in some way or another if I want to. And I think that's what makes it, I think it's going to be fascinating these next 6 weeks.
It's funny because, like I said, paralysis by analysis, there's so much information there. We finally, again, heard Chris Ballard speak, and now, especially since it's, we kind of heard him finally talk about specifically the number 1 overall pick and kind of what he likes now that we're kind of into draft season. So it's funny. You took it one way of, actually, maybe they will stay at 4, and you kind of feel maybe more towards that than we ever have before in, let's say, the last month or so, or even really 2 months, really, since the Texans won Week 18 and cost themselves the number 1 overall pick. It's funny. I listened to that and actually felt more confident that they're going up to number 1 for a few reasons. Number 1, let me throw this by you here, this theory. Who is going to be the more driving force for the Colts trading up to number 1? Is it going to be Chris Ballard or Shane Steichen? Because I think for me, it's going to be Shane Steichen. Because the one thing Chris Ballard said, and that what made me kind of think that is, he was asked basically, what would it take for you to trade up to number 1? And he said, conviction. Basically, no doubt that that's the guy. And for me, I get Chris Ballard has done this, scouting-wise a lot longer than Shane Steichen in terms of look at this specific class, because Ballard obviously does it every year. Shane Steichen was just in the Super Bowl 2 weeks ago and didn't know he was going to be the Colts head coach until recently. So it's like he was watching Bryce Young and CJ Stroud this past season. He was worried about game planning for the Eagles. So I feel like for me right now, Chris Ballard could say, yeah, we feel comfortable at 4. We'll get the best player. I like where we are at 4. But Chris Ballard has shown you so far in his tenure in the Colts, he is willing to defer to what the head coach has done, right? Many times he has, kind of given the players, whether it's Paris Campbell that Frank Reich liked, whether it's approving and going after Carson Wentz to kind of pair him with Frank Reich. Chris Ballard has shown a consistency that he will do what the head coach wants and build a team in the eye of the head coach. So I think if we're sitting here now, this is no guarantee, but I think at the end of the day, we will see Shane Steichen identify one quarterback, whether it's Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, it could be Anthony Richardson or Will Levis, right? That's the one question. Obviously, we'll find out what Steichen likes. But I think if he does identify one quarterback, it says, Chris, this is the guy. This is the guy I think we can win with the most. This is the guy I think is the best fit for our offense. The other three guys have all of positive traits, but this is the guy I think has separated himself from the group. This is my guy. I think Chris Ballard then will say, you know what? Fine. That's the guy we need. I'll go up to number one here. That's, to me, one of the reasons why I do think that at the end of the day, it's going to be more Shane Steichen driving the bus for them trading up compared to Chris Ballard, the GM. I'm curious your thoughts. Like, how do you view that, the power dynamic, if you will? Like, who's going to be more influential, I guess we'll call it, in the Colts possibly trading up or staying at 4?
No, I think that's a really good thought process there, and it's one that I agree with in a lot of ways. And I think Jim Irsay factors into this too. I mean, I think it's going to be a 3-man decision when you're talking about the quarterback and how important that is. I think you're going to have the owner in that conversation very heavily as well. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think you're absolutely right with what you're talking about with Steichen. He was getting ready for the Super Bowl. He had Jalen Hurts. There's no way he spent any time this season, really digging into these quarterbacks. He had no reason to. I'm sure their plan all along was to do it around this time of year and get started, because you're going to, even when you have Hurts, you're still going to look at this quarterback class just in case. You never know what's going to happen. What if they hadn't looked at Jalen Hurts, a couple of years ago,
right,
and hadn't considered it? So there's no doubt that they would have gotten into it eventually, but I do think that he's just starting on the process. And, Ballard said that very plainly, that a big part of this evaluation is the coaches and that they haven't gotten involved yet. For one thing, they haven't finalized the coaching staff yet. It's tough to really go in and have meetings about the draft to finalize things before that happens. And I think that there's no doubt between the two of them, Steichen will be the one that's going to change this thinking the most right now, because if he comes in, like you said, and he has a real strong feeling towards one of these guys, that's going to carry a lot of weight with Chris Ballard. There's no question about that. We've seen it time and time again, going back to Philip Rivers. When they signed him, that was a lot of the background with Frank Reich and trying to make that happen, and just his general philosophy. I mean, I think anybody who's listened to him, more than one offseason has heard him talk about tying the scouts in with the coaches. They have, I'm sure they're going to do that at some point soon. They basically have classes where they get the coaches and the scouts together, and the coaches are more or less teaching the scouts what they want at every position. So the defense coaches are going to go in there and say, the Mike linebacker, this is what he needs to do, and I need this, this, and this from him. And the scouts, will look at that based on that. Now, obviously, that's not going to play a big role in this year's draft because they're not defensively. It will, because they know those guys. But on the offensive side, there's not enough time, for them to suddenly switch what they've been doing all fall and into the early part of the winter and now go. But they will pick guys that fit that among the guys that they've graded. You're not going to change your whole board. You're not going to have a board full of prospects to fit this offense now. You're just going to pick from those guys who fits the best. Quarterback, though, is the one that I think there is time to blow it up because it's such an important position that you just say, okay, even if you were leaning towards Will Levis, I'm just throwing a name out, that's your guy all through the winter, all through up to this date. You get in that room with Shane Steichen and Jim Bob Cooter and Cam Turner, and they say, no, the way we coach this and what we're looking for, it's Bryce Young. You do blow that up. I think there is time to do it. The position kind of demands it. So I definitely think the coaches are going to drive this. And I think Jim Irsay's more likely to get excited if the head coach is excited in this situation. If Steichen is coming to him and saying, it may have already happened, that we know he fell in love with Shane on a Friday night in that interview. It's possible there that Steichen had an idea for one of these guys. And they're just going to hammer it out. But I definitely, and that's what I mean when I say paralysis by analysis. You can come up with probably about 40 scenarios right now, and I would say that makes sense. That could happen.
Especially when there's no clear-cut number one quarterback. You're right. This is going to be a very dizzying, let's say, next 2 months for sure. But I'm glad you brought up Jim Irsay. So one of the reasons why I think I feel more empowered that the Colts are going to go to number one is because I think it's more going to be Shane Steichen driving the bus, if you will, to trade up because he identifies the guy that this is the guy out of the four I think is the best fit for our team. We've seen Chris Ballard, again, acquiesce what the head coach wants. That's number one. Number two, I'm glad you brought up Jim Irsay. I think for Chris Ballard, after the introductory press conference, when you had Jim Irsay, whether he was telling the truth or not, again, I don't think Jim Irsay is a big card player, poker player. So I don't think he was trying to deceive the Texans and thinking, oh, we love Bryce Young and fake them into trading up to number one when in reality they love CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson and kind of pull the old okey doke and force the Texans to trade up and give up assets for a quarterback they never had interest in. I think Jim Irsay was genuinely excited that, I like Bryce Young from what I've seen so far. That's my guy. And I think a lot of what Wednesday with Chris Ballard was trying to do was backpedal from those comments from Jim Irsay for two reasons. Number one, I think to lower the price on the Bears, because again, if you're the Bears, you think, if the Colts are desperate, they love Bryce Young, they're going to trade up to number one, and we could basically ask for any price we want. I think part of Chris Ballard now is trying to pour cold water on this to try to show the Bears, there's some quarterbacks we like, right now, and Chris Ballard said it, we have no conviction. Like, there's not one guy I look at that is worth trading up to number one. I think that's just PR to try to, again, send a message to the Bears, maybe lower the asking price on a trade from 2 first-round picks to maybe 1 and a second, or, maybe get one player to the draft or out of the trade, whatever it is. I think Chris Ballard is actively trying to lower the price. But also, too, I think he's also trying to show the Texans, or maybe not give his cards away to Texans, because we don't know right now what Houston wants. Right? They really, at pick number 2, they can stay there. If they like equally Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, they don't have to move. And they can say, we talked about that on the podcast earlier this week. If they like both quarterbacks, they'll probably sit there number 2 and take whatever one the Colts or someone else trades up for, they don't take. But what if the Texans do like Bryce Young? What if they love Bryce Young? And now, if you are the Colts and all you're talking about is, we love Bryce, and you're dropping hints, and Jim Irsay saying this, and Chris Ballard loves, there's one quarterback we really do love right now, and you can kind of put 2 and 2 together. It's Bryce Young. That only motivates the Texans to either up their offer or be more active in trading up to number 1 compared to maybe what they are now. So I think if you're Chris Ballard, I think the whole point of Wednesday was to, again, try to lower the price from what the Bears are asking for in a trade, but also maybe lull, if you will, the Texans into a little bit of complacency of, we don't have to be as gung-ho to trade up to number 1 because the Colts on the surface seemingly are not in love with any of the 4 quarterbacks and seemingly are content at 4 compared to them loving number 1. You kind of put the pieces together. If that's the same quarterback you love with the Texans, then obviously they'll be inclined to trade up to number 1. So that's, to me at least, 2 of the reasons why I think Chris Ballard tried his hardest and tried as much as he could to kind of seem as disinterested in trading up to number 1 and seeming like he's not in love with any quarterback right now.
Yeah, and it may just be true. I mean, that's another part of it too,
That's
because the process
also
is
true.
the process is so new. I think we're still very early in this, considering that Shane Steichen's only been here for 2 weeks. That they may not be. Doesn't mean they're not leaning in a certain direction. Doesn't mean there isn't a front runner in the clubhouse. But they may not be sold yet on anybody to the extent that they want to go all the way up to number 1. I think that's the way the best bluffs are built, right? If you are going to throw a smoke screen, you are going to bluff to any degree, basing it in truth helps it, because it's more believable. I mean, if you're saying something that you truly believe in that moment, even if chances are it's going to change, you got a better chance of somebody else believing it as well. And I think that's a big factor here. Another big factor with this, though, there's a lot of buzz, a lot of smoke. I've talked to you about this, a little bit earlier, that D'Amico Ryan's very interested in Bryce Young. There's an Alabama tie there. D'Amico's an Alabama guy. But that could be both ways too. Is that smoke screen on Houston's side, to try to get the Colts to go up and get him? I don't know, but there's a lot of talk about that the Texans really like him. And I'll tell you what, I came away from D'Amico Ryan's availability yesterday with an idea that I had not had before. I kind of forgot that he was there in San Francisco when Jimmy G arrived, and he saw the way Garoppolo changed the entire trajectory of that franchise, especially that season. So could they be a team? And he said point blank, they want to sign a guy and they want to draft a guy. That's, they've only really got Davis Mills on the roster. They want to bring in 2 quarterbacks, 1 in free agency, 1 in the draft. Could they be a team that brings in Jimmy Garoppolo? He's got ties to the GM as well, and Nick Caserio, and then goes after like an Anthony Richardson, either at 2 or take like Will Anderson at 2 and try to trade back up with all that capital you got from Cleveland, use the number 12 pick to get back up and go after a guy like Anthony Richardson, who could maybe grow behind him. I hadn't really considered that before, but it's on the table. And that's why, again, You can make so many scenarios out there. Houston really does love Bryce Young. Look at D'Amico. Look at the Alabama connection. Houston wants the Colts to think they love Bryce Young to get them up. There are so many, possible combinations out there, and so many things that just make sense that you can make a case for it. That's why I'm getting sort of paralysis by analysis. But also, I think the most intriguing thing about this draft is the fact that you've got the Texans and the Colts 2 picks away from each other, both in need of a quarterback, both in the same division. I think that what was already an intriguing situation, because you've got 4 guys and it's hard to separate them, and there's no consensus number one. You can make a case for all 4 of these guys. You can make a case against all 4 of these guys. Then you throw in the division rivalry, and it's just, and the fact that the number 1 pick is for sale. It's like a movie script.
That's fascinating. I did not think about that connection with Jimmy G and D'Amico Ryans, kind of going back to when they made the initial trade. I think it was 2017, if I'm not mistaken, right at the trade deadline, when he came in and kind of, like I said, won the last 5 games and kind of took a losing team in the 49ers and obviously turned them around to now where they are one of the best teams in the NFL. That's actually a really interesting point, because you said they have 2-12. So if you really wanted to sign Jimmy G, take the best defensive player at that time, whether it's Will Anderson Jr., whether it's Jalen Carter, and who knows with his draft stock now after his 2 arrest warrants and he's officially booked for a misdemeanor. So that's obviously going to be another storyline to watch these next 2 months as well. But that's interesting, because the Texans, similar to the Bears, do need a lot of help everywhere. Do need a lot of help, especially on defense as well. So they are not in the position you would think to where, maybe they don't want to give up future assets because they need so much help. So maybe they say, you know what, we'll sign Jimmy G. He'll be our starter in 2023. And like I said, at 12, we'll use that to either sit there if Anthony Richardson's stock starts to plummet, or Will Levis's stock starts to plummet, or trade up to, 5, 6 with the Lions, maybe 7 with the Raiders, and see what you can do to get an Anthony Richardson type of guy. Listen, selfishly, I hope that's the plan, because obviously that just frees up Bryce Young. Now, I'm very, like I said, nervous that if D'Amico Ryans does love Bryce Young, the Texans as an organization seem like with the D'Amico Ryans hire, he's kind of their savior. It's kind of, at least on the outside, how I feel. So if D'Amico Ryans likes Bryce Young and that's his guy, I think the Texans and Nick Caserio will do whatever it takes to get Bryce Young, whether it is trading up to number 1, whether it is, sitting there at 2. But if Bryce is the guy, I have really no doubts the Texans will try to do whatever they can to make sure that they get him. Because like you said, it's not just, oh, you missed out on him. Okay, that swing and a miss. Damn, we wish you had him. But if you miss, swing and miss, and it's the Colts that get him, well, now you're seeing him twice in your division every single year for the next decade. So it's like one of those things where it's almost a double whammy of, and same thing with the Colts, it works vice versa. If Bryce Young is your guy, if you are Shane Steichen, and Chris Ballard says, yeah, I like him, I don't love him, I don't want to give up, the asking price high, I'm not going to give up all that capital, move up, we're going to sit here at 4, we'll take CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson or Will Levis, whoever they take. Again, you swing and miss, and you are wrong, Not only do you miss out on a great quarterback, but you also have to see if the Texans get him twice a year, every year. So just, again, heightens the importance and just adds to the intrigue and drama that is going to be surrounding these 2 teams specifically the next 2 months. And like I said, it's a lot of smoke screens. We can, maybe my read of Chris Ballard's press conference is totally wrong. Maybe your read of Chris Ballard's press conference is totally wrong. With D'Amico Ryans, like I said, maybe he loves Bryce Young to get the Colts to move up and kind of flush some of their future assets down the drain when they, in fact, like CJ Stroud or Anthony Richardson, whatever. Like, it's one of those things where we talked about on Tuesday's pod. It's a lot of lying this next 2 months. It's a lot of deception. Every single story you hear, you got to think of not only what the story's about, but who's it coming from? Who does it benefit? That's really the biggest thing I can say the next 2 months is, who is a story, where is it coming from? Who does it benefit? Whether it's a character assassination on a certain quarterback, whether it's a puffing up of a certain quarterback. Why is this story out there? Who could it come from, and who does it benefit? That's really any kind of story you have to hear now the next 2 months. That's where you have to really think about it from that angle to kind of make sure that, again, we try to get as much truth here, if there's any truth at this point, out there. But at least we heard Shane Steichen, we heard Chris Ballard, we heard, like I said, we heard D'Amico Ryans well talk. So everyone's been talking the last 2 days. A lot is in the air, George. Also interesting, maybe, again, this is lying. Maybe this is also truth. But I thought it was very interesting, the quarterback traits that both Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen were asked about. And they kind of talked about it to highlight in case you missed it. When it comes to at least Chris Ballard, the traits he looks for in a quarterback, he said fast mind, accurate, makes plays when the game is on the line, can navigate the pocket really well. Shane Steichen kind of echoed a lot of those similar traits as well. When he was asked about it, he said accuracy. He specifically said, on a 3rd and 8, when it's one of those gotta have it plays, 4th quarter, 3rd and 8, to either ice the game or continue a drive to take the lead or tie the game, you got to deliver. You got to be able to make that 3rd and 8 throw, have the it factor. And both, interestingly, actually, let's just start there before we get into the size, because that's obviously a whole different discussion. You hear kind of basically similar traits that the way Chris Ballard views a quarterback, the way Shane Steichen views a quarterback: accuracy, fast mind, navigates the pocket, and kind of has that it factor, if you will. What would you make about those traits from how the GM and the head coach view these potential quarterback prospects?
Yeah, playmaking, that was a big part of it. I think one of the other big things that Chris Ballard said early on was, winning. He wants a quarterback that wins games. Kind of a crazy thing to want from a quarterback, but hey, that's where he's going with that. But hot no, take. It's hot take from the GM there. That's what I mean. When I looked at it and you listen to all the things that they talk about, when they talk about accuracy, the first guy that comes in my mind is CJ Stroud. He's incredibly accurate. When they talk about it factor, that could mean Will Levis. I mean, if you talk to people at Kentucky, he's almost a cult hero on that campus. They really, that team got behind him in a major, major way. Leadership, I think, is one of his biggest selling points in this. When you talk about creativity, playmaking, and, toughness, Bryce Young comes to mind almost immediately, because he's that guy. He's going to go out there and he's going to find a way, even if it's not. I had heard a story that he brought game plans in himself. The coaches did game plans. He brought game plans in himself into these Alabama meetings. It's next level stuff from him. Quick mind, that's him. And it's CJ Stroud, the quick processing, the quick thinking. That's what you hear about those two right away. And then, Shane Steichen talked a lot about being on the cutting edge, being able to see what the guy's going to be in the future and the future of the game. And that's probably Anthony Richardson. So I feel like you can make a case for any one of these guys. And I think that's what's so compelling. I think Bryce Young checks the most of those boxes. If you're going to put them all on a list and do one of those charts, and we've got everybody's quarterback's names on the top, and down the side, we've got all the traits they're looking for. I think you're going to have the most check marks under Bryce Young. But I think you'd see them for every one of the players, having a couple in there. And again, it just adds to how fascinating this process is.
And obviously, like we talked, and Shane Steichen too in his opening press conference mentioned that kind of it was accuracy, decision-making, and playmaking is kind of the 3 traits he looks for. So again, a lot of that was echoed on Wednesday and something with Chris Ballard. The one thing that kind of stuck out to me that I thought was really interesting, that again, you tell me, I am trying to look at this objective. Like I'll be honest, I don't want to have a Bryce Young bias. I'm not trying to look at this with Bryce Young colored glasses. I'm trying to look at it objectively. So you tell me if I'm being biased here. But one thing I heard, both Ballard and Steichen said that, again, really kind of had me thinking, okay, they're not saying it, and I hope they don't say it, but I think deep in their mind, they think Bryce Young is their number 1 quarterback, and I think that's going to be the guy they end up, kind of having on their big board number 1. So they talk both about playing fast, reading defenses, talking about, being able to pre-snap, post-snap, make decisions fast. And I'm glad you brought up that story on Bryce Young, where I think it was on Sundays, I believe, not mistaken. So literally the day after the game, he would come in already with a scouting report on the next opponent, talking about checks at the line. How can we protect this better? What kind of plays can we run for this opponent? The next day in college, you rarely see that from quarterbacks. And I just feel like, to me, when you talk about processing, I think it's also a very important factor that we don't really talk about a lot, because you can't measure that, right? You can't put him on a scale. You can't look at him on a field and look at his arm strength to see how far he can throw the ball and how accurate he is. When you talk about just processing information, when you get the ball post-snap, especially in the NFL, that's the biggest difference with college and the NFL, is disguises and post-snap, where the defense is actually going to come from, blitzing-wise or coverage-wise. I feel like that's one of the areas that is very important, especially for a rookie quarterback. And that is when a lot of guys struggle early on, that's really the biggest area that is the problem area, right? They talk about the game so much faster. That's basically code for, I got to figure out faster what the defense is going and where to go with the ball. And we talked about Bryce Young being a point guard. You watch him in Alabama, whatever kind of film you watch, that to me is what stands out head and shoulders above everything else, is his ability to process information and make decisions quickly. CJ Stroud is very gifted and talented. The one thing, though, for me, and it kind of goes a little bit hand in hand with playmaking, is that he would get confused and not really know where to go with the ball, roll out, and still not be able to kind of find that open guy, even with all the talent Ohio State had. That was, to me, one of his areas where he kind of struggled the most, was reading a defense and knowing where to go with the ball. If he got confused or his first reader wasn't open, outside of the Georgia game, which of course in the biggest game of his career, he does all of that masterfully. But that was kind of creating plays when the play breaks down, or creating plays when your first or second read's not there. That, to me, again, is something that Bryce Young was able to do tremendously at Alabama in the last 2 years, was get that information, process it. And again, when you hear Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen kind of talk about that, I think it's super important. I'm really glad that's one of their top traits, because again, how you kind of hit the ground running, I should say, is by having a quarterback that understands defenses, is able to make decisions. And sure, maybe accuracy is not the best, or maybe, again, maybe you don't have just the players around them to run your offense, but at least if they know where they're going with the ball, then everything else to me seems easy. And you could fix playmakers, you could fix protections, you can, scheme up even, better plays and more creative plays once they understand kind of the basics. And that, to me, is, again, something that is a box that Bryce Young checks definitely better than all the other quarterbacks right now we're talking about.
Yeah, and I've also heard some guys say that, when you look at this Philadelphia offense that they built around Jalen Hurts, a lot of that, they borrowed a lot of things from Alabama, that there were a lot of things in that offense that Bryce Young was running, that Jalen Hurts was running, at the NFL level. Now, there's a lot of things they're not, too. You're not going to do the push sneak with Bryce Young.
Yeah, I
You're
don't think so.
Gonna get him murdered,
They have to re-sign Jacoby Brissett for that.
Right.
Just for that.
Right. Just for that moment. And you're not going to run him nearly as much as Hurts ran. And that's not if you want him to play very long in this league. That's pretty clear. But a lot of the passing concept in particular were similar to what Bryce Young's running at Alabama. So it's another thing that you just throw into that long pile of information and go, okay, that's interesting. That makes sense. Like I said before, I think if you're just going to line them up and say who checks the most boxes, who best fits the profile of the guy that they're talking about, I think it's Young and Stroud. I think they're the two that kind of stand out when they're talking about accuracy, decision making. They're the two that sort of hit the most of those boxes, with Young hitting the very most. There's been a lot of talk the last week or so about Ohio State's offense, and about it being, I don't know, I'm looking for the right word, too regimented, maybe. Too much is dictated to the quarterback. And so it's hard to know some of the things, that some of the questions that are there about Stroud were there about Justin Fields too. And I think some of that is born of the way that the offense is being taught and the way that the offense is being run, just from different talks, this week down here. And it's just another thing that makes it hard to evaluate those kind of things. If you're basically being told this is where the ball goes on this play, and you're not being told to make that decision, that could account for some of that indecision that you saw from CJ Stroud and from Justin Fields. But also, it's going to be there at the next level as well, because you're going to have to develop that. It's going to take time. And I think it's one of the things that Chris Ballard said yesterday. All these quarterbacks need development, all of them.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the process here. It's going to be that way with all these guys. I don't think there's any of them that are a slam dunk week one starter. I think some of them are much more likely to earn that spot than others. It's hard to imagine Levis or Richardson being the starter on week one, for instance. I think they've got more work to do. But that's why, again, we could go through this, and we will, for 6 weeks. You can make a case for and against all four of these guys. And it's going to be one of the most fascinating drafts as far as quarterbacks go, I think, in a long time, not just to find out how they shake out, which is obviously the first thing we're going to know, where they go and when they go, but 2-3 years down the line, who stands out from this group, I think, is going to be really fascinating to watch.
And to add to the mystery, we'll say, George, Chris Ballard, again, yesterday during his media availability, was, of course, asked about measurables, right? Because that's been the big thing. Chris Ballard, he's had a history of going by measurables. He wants, he's a traits guy. He's someone who wants a strong arm, big, strong quarterback, especially at that position, he has been known to kind of stick to the bigger size quarterbacks. And obviously 3 of those quarterbacks fit the bill. The one that does not is Bryce Young. I thought it was very interesting. My ears did go up and kind of perk up a little bit when you had Chris Ballard on Wednesday say that quarterbacks come in all different shapes and sizes, and was then asked a follow-up question. He said he still wants to stick by the measurables, but then also admitted in the same sentence, there are exceptions. It sounds like slowly Chris Ballard is opening the door and is basically not ruling out Bryce Young right away because of his height and weight. Now we'll get his height and weight officially on Saturday. We'll guess his height and weight here in a little bit as kind of a little fun exercise. But even though we don't know at least right now the exact numbers he's going to weigh in and what his size is going to be, we know it's going to be small, definitely smaller than the other 3 quarterbacks. But Chris Ballard, again, is opening the door, or at least on the surface, is more open to changing his approach for a Bryce Young quarterback than maybe he was in the past.
And I think that's part of why, my takeaway right now being that I don't think they're going to trade up in the moment. That can change. And I think you're going to hear me change a lot as this process goes on, is because I think they're open to everything right now. And I think they should be. And the way that when you listen to Steichen and you listen to Ballard, and like I said, you could make a case for all 4 guys. If you want to cherry pick quotes here and there, you can make a case for all 4 guys. But I think all that is telling us is that they are open to all 4 guys right now, that they are seriously digging into this. They are considering all their options, and they haven't ruled anybody out. And I think that's the way you've got to go into it. You can't go into it saying, Young's too small and we're not even going to look at him. Richardson is too raw and we're not even going to look at him. Levis turned the ball over too much. And we're not even going to look at him. Stroud, it was in too simplified of an offense or too regimented an offense or whatever. We're not going to look at him. I don't think you can do that. And it's good to see that they're not. I think that's the one takeaway that I feel really solid in, that they're not ruling anybody out based on whatever the war is that they're carrying with them into this process. And I think the other thing that Ballard said pretty plainly, and I believe that he was being, upfront with it. If this process plays out and they determine one of these guys is at the top of the list and is worth going up and giving up, the assets it's going to take to do it, then they'll make that move. I still think if they do it, Bryce Young's most likely to be that guy. It's harder to imagine them making that move for one of the other 3.
I would agree with that. Right. I think if they trade up, that would, for me, signal, right, it is Bryce Young. I don't think they'd be doing it for CJ Stroud. Definitely not Anthony Richardson. I would say definitely not Will Levis. That is for sure. I'm with you there. And I think also you're all right when it comes to right now leaving the door open for everybody. Again, we just talked about it to start the show. Shane Steichen's been in the job for 3 weeks? And for the most part now, the majority of those 3 weeks has been hiring a coaching staff. Mm-hmm. So he's barely been able so far to dig in on the quarterbacks, especially. So it's malpractice at this point to rule out any quarterback just because your head coach who's going to be working directly with the quarterback, the head coach that you basically directly hired to work with and develop a young quarterback, let him make his own judgments first before you say, Shane, you know what? I seen Anthony Richardson too up and down. Not for us. We're going to cross off the list. Or Bryce Young too small. Cross off the list. It's one of those things where, like I said, you have to have an open process. You got to find the guy for you, and in order to find the perfect guy, you have to look at each one individually and be open to each one individually and picture, can they be in our offense going forward here? And that's how you start to whittle down the differences and what separates one quarterback from another. And that's how you ultimately get to your final answer of, this is our guy. This is the guy that we have to find. I will find it funny. Actually, I do find it funny. At least from a national media perspective, looking at yesterday how people reacted to Chris Ballard's press conference, that a lot of people did have a main takeaway being Chris Ballard's not going to trade up. The Colts are not trading up to number 1. They don't like anyone in this draft. I would say so far that's PR 101 from Chris Ballard. And I, as someone who wants them to trade up, who thinks they will trade up, that was actually the perfect message. I'm glad that was coming out, because I think the last thing you want to do is spew desperation, or I should say, I guess, wreak desperation. That's how you screw yourself. I think that's really, for almost any team that has been desperate for, whether it's a head coach or a quarterback or a certain player, it's always really worked to their detriment because teams have taken advantage of that desperation. I think that's, to me so far, at least if you want to say the overarching theme coming out of, at least nationally, if you look at a national, 10,000 foot view of the scouting combine in the last 2 days, that is the exact narrative I would like the Colts to be in right now, compared to them being, they're all in, they're definitely going to trade. And then all you do is just make the Bears' life better, and you have the Texans licking their chops about moving up as well.
It was interesting because some of the first headlines I saw yesterday were, Ballard says Colts won't move up. And I'm like, it's not what he said. He said that they're not doing it right now. And that's why, like I said, I go back and forth. When I left the building yesterday, I thought it's more likely that they're moving up, just because of he's open to it. And I still feel that way, but I also feel like, I don't know, there's some things that he said that make me think that maybe they'll stay, that they think they can get their guy. But again, it goes back to what I said just a couple of minutes ago. I think all options are on the table right now. All options. And you're absolutely right. There was zero chance he was going to walk into that room yesterday and say, we are trading up to number one unless the deal was done.
Right.
I mean, there's no way he's going to walk in there and say that and hand that kind of gift to the Bears so they can then just start asking for, everything that they could possibly dream of in a deal. I don't know. I guess ultimately the reason I think that I'm more in the it might not happen camp right now is that I don't know at this point that I feel like there's somebody there that he's going to want to give up everything you're going to have to give it. It's going to be a costly move. We all know that. It's going to be a very costly move. That's just the way it is. You go up to one, you're going to give up something that hurts. You don't get up there on the cheap. And I'm not sure that they're sold yet on a quarterback. Well, he said they're not sold yet on a quarterback to get there. Doesn't mean they won't be by the time this process is over. And I think that's an important element that's being left out of a lot of these reports right now.
Right. This is just the beginning. You're going to have your first in-person meetings with these quarterbacks. So you finally get kind of the first feel of who they are, what kind of person they are, what kind of quarterback they can be. This is just the beginning of the process. This is not the end. This is not halftime. So like I said, there's going to be a lot of pro days, a lot of, individual visits, personal, private meetings as well. So there's going to be a lot of homework done, especially on these four quarterbacks here the next 2 months before we finally get a decision. So I'm with you. Right now, Chris Ballard cannot have a guy number one. That's fine. That's no problem at all. And honestly, maybe that's even the better way to do so, because kind of like when he went through the head coaching search at this point, a few months ago, don't go in there biased. Like that's the one thing. Like I like Bryce Young, you like Bryce Young. But the thing is for Chris Ballard is you want to get it right. You can't go in there with one guy and basically see what you want to see, because the last time he did that was Josh McDaniels, and that absolutely failed.
Right.
So if you're Chris Ballard, learn from that. I think he did a great job in the head coaching search. Obviously, we'll see what Shane Steichen is as a head coach, but so far from what I've heard, his philosophy, I like the hiring a lot. I think this fits what the Colts really need. So you went in there with open mind, and I think got the best guy for the specific job for where the Colts are right now. And I think going forward, you have to use that same logic, same philosophy in drafting a quarterback for where this team is right now, and pick a guy that fits your team and what Shane Steichen could do and get the most out of that quarterback as well. I also love the fact that both Steichen and Ballard basically said the quarterback is going to be the offense. Like Shane Steichen's system is not going to, the quarterback's not going to fit into what Shane Steichen wants to do. He's going to build an offense around that specific quarterback. That is the way to do it. That's how you win in the NFL. And again, it's another kind of feather in the cap going forward of this process so far, where I have no complaints. I think they're doing it so far. Grade A, obviously a long way to go, but I do like what we've heard so far. Let's wrap up with this, George. Play a little game. Bryce Young will weigh in on Saturday. I believe Saturday morning is the big weigh-in. Now, I saw Jonathan Jones of CBS Sports talk to a few execs, a few agents, a few sources, we'll say. And they said that there is some concern or some thought that Bryce Young will be under 200 pounds when he weighs in on Saturday. Do you have a guess? Do you want to guess a weight of what Bryce Young will be stepping on the scale, what the number is going to be come Saturday morning?
Now, I hope for his sake it's 201, because I know that's really the big that's really the big talk around here, is that he might be under 200 pounds, and that's what makes this a historic outlier. It's not the height. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, he's 5'10", he's 5'10 and a quarter, whatever he's going to come in there. That part they can deal with. There have been guys under 6 foot, even just the last few years, that have come in and played well enough. I don't think the league's worried about that so much as they are right now, the weight, and can he take that pounding? Like that's ultimately you're going to have to be really comfortable with that if you're going to trade up to number one. I think that's going to be the big determining factor for him, even for any team, not just the Colts. Any team trading up to number one is going to have to feel really good with that. So, we joked before, like, drink a lot of sweet tea, get yourself, as heavy as you can be, bring as much water weight into that.
Holding that
as
pee.
you possibly can.
Don't be peeing anytime soon.
From what I hear, I think it's gonna be around 190 to 195. I mean, if it's, if the numbers at Alabama are anything to go by, And there are people that said that, his playing weight was maybe closer to 175 this year. So, I mean, the size concerns are legitimate. That's definitely a big part of this process. And it's why right now I'm not leaning towards saying the Colts are going to trade up. Doesn't mean, maybe Saturday morning that changes. We'll see how that goes.
All right. So I'll put you down for what? 195? Is that your official guess? 195. I'm going to go 204. I'm going to say 204 because I think at this point, two things. Number one, or really one thing, the weight's been the biggest discussion. So you'd assume, I would assume, that one of the areas Bryce Young's trainers are working in the most is, all right, how can we get some meaningful weight on him here? And how can we, at least when he goes to Indianapolis, it's not a shock of, like you said, 185. And everyone's like, oh my God, this is absurd. Get him out of here. I think that's one of the areas they'd be focusing on is, like, again, good weight. We're not talking about just fat and just eating In-N-Out burgers 3 times a day, every day here to just get any sort of weight on you. Yeah. Not my diet of Doritos last night at like 1 a.m. That's for sure. But get some muscle on him. Now, I don't know if this is transferable or not, but I saw Zay Flowers of Boston College. Obviously, this is circulating social media. He basically, I think it was right after the season ended. And like now this week going to the combine, he had 13 pounds of muscle. His body just looks insanely dead. It's almost night and day for what has been, 6 weeks or so, 2 months of training. So if you could do that, Bryce Young, I think, could also add a good amount of poundage as well. So I'll say 204 because it's funny. Like, it's almost kind of like when you're underage and it's like people ask your age if you're at a bar and you get in there illegally. It's like, how old are you? You never say 21 because that's a dead giveaway. It's 22. So I don't think he's going to be right at 200 because that's just one of those dead giveaways. I'll say he'll get a little bit over just to kind of leave no doubt. That's why I'll go 204 official weigh-in. But boy, it's going to be, I would love to know I don't know. Do they, you know better than me. Do they have the weigh-in visible or no?
No. I mean, they're like, the teams will. I mean, they're down there, but it's nobody, who's not working directly for an NFL, affiliation, will be down there watching that. But it's going to be the most anticipated weigh-in. There'll probably be footage of it on NFL Network once it's done. I mean, it's going to be that big of a deal. It'll be really interesting to see. I think you look at that Zay Flowers situation, like, they look like those old Charles Atlas ads. I mean, really, like, from before and after. And you got to figure that maybe not that same regiment, but that, if the people that Bryce Young's training with are worth their salt at all, that's been the focus since the season ended.
Yes, absolutely. I was joking before. I'd love to know the media scrum surrounding that scale and just see like an overhead view, just how deep it is just to see Bryce Young weigh in and what that scale does say. And I'd love to hear if there's like an audible, if it's like 185 though, the gas, or even like 204. I can't believe he's heavier than we thought. You're right. This might be the most anticipated weigh-in maybe in NFL combine history. I can't, at least for the life of me, recently think of a quarterback where we dissected their weight more than anything else. Hand size has been a big deal. Recently we've seen, height discussed with Russell Wilson and Baker Mayfield, but really even with those quarterbacks, it's never been about weight and how much actually their frame is. It's always just been about the height. This is going to be, boy, oh boy, that scale is going to be the most interesting weigh-in. We will see. We'll see in a while.
I'm looking forward to seeing him in person tomorrow morning. It'll be the first time that I've actually like stood near him and get to see, what he actually looks like in person, because that's a big part of this too. I think a lot of times with these guys, you go in with one opinion and then they get in the room. I remember the first time I saw Andrew Luck, I was like, he's a tight end. He's unbelievably huge. It'll be interesting to see how that goes tomorrow. I think it's one of the more, there's a lot of reasons to be excited about tomorrow. All the quarterbacks are going to talk. It's going to be a really, really big day here at the combine. But for me, one of the biggest things is, standing somewhere near him as close as I can get, and just, judging for myself. How small is he really?
How tall are you, George?
About 5'8".
Okay. So I think it's a good size measurement. I would be shocked if he's anywhere near, if you guys are looking at eye level, maybe we're in big trouble.
That's not good.
That is not good whatsoever. But that's okay. That's so we can get. Hopefully you're looking, your neck's going to be looking up, maybe 5'11". Could we get to 6 foot maybe? But that's going to be size them up and see how, you can kind of compare. And that's definitely going to be, looking forward to Friday. That's for sure. Speaking of Friday, Georgia, like you said, just mentioned, you'll be on the scene there. So make sure now is better than ever. Wherever you're listening, whether you're watching on YouTube, Blue Horseshoe Pod, whether you're listening to us, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, we're all there. make sure you like and subscribe to the Blue Horseshoe Pod. Again, especially if you're listening on podcasts, we have the same name as our old feed or our old podcast name, but different feed. So it's very important. Look for the blue logo, the Blue Horseshoe Pod logo. That is where all new episodes going forward will be found. So make sure you subscribe to that. And you can make sure you get all our content, especially tomorrow. And we putting out a lot of stuff, George, especially George, on scene. How does Bryce Young look? We'll get obviously some of his answers. We'll get the much anticipated weigh-in for sure as well on Saturday. So we got a lot of content coming your way, especially the next few days when it comes to the quarterbacks, which obviously everyone in Indy and outside of Indy, if you're a Colts fan outside of the state, at least like I am, we'll be watching intently the next 2 days here to hear and see what Bryce Young does look like, even though he's not going to be thrown at the combine. Still a lot questions to answer. So no better time, I should say, right now to download, subscribe on YouTube, on wherever you get your podcasts, and also subscribe on YouTube, the Blue Horseshoe Pod. And also, if you have any questions you want myself or George to answer, especially George on the scene, so any combine questions you want George especially to answer, email us. BlueHorseshoePod@gmail.com. Very simple. BlueHorseshoePod@gmail.com. We will get to your questions as well. So that's where you can email us, reach out, and send any question you have our way as well. So, George, it's Thursday, so it's defensive lineman and linebackers day. Normally, that's a day that Chris Ballard loves, him with the interior, but I think this year is a little different. These next 2 days, Friday and Saturday, are going to be they are going to be big ones to help shape the next 5 years. That's for sure.
No doubt about it. These interviews this week, I think are the most important things going on. We've talked about that a lot this week on the pod. And I think you could almost throw everything else out the window. These interviews and Bryce Young's weigh-in, probably the most important things going on this week. Cause one thing I think everyone can agree from listening to Steichen and Ballard yesterday, that whiteboard is going to play a big role in this process as well.
Oh, it is. And like you said, we talked about it on Tuesday's pod. The most important aspect of the scouting combine for the Colts, I guess one instance we'll see is going to be the weigh-in for Bryce Young. But it's also, like you said, going to be those 15-minute meetings with each of the quarterbacks. It's the one area we will not know, but it's not going to be on video. We're probably not going to hear much from any of the teams on how it went, good or bad. But those 15 minutes, at least to start, are going to be easily, I think, the most important aspect of this entire scouting combine for the Colts when it comes to figuring out your quarterback going forward as well. So a very busy week here. It's really kind of getting going. Now is when the fun starts. Now we got the quarterbacks talking, working out, getting their measurements. So make sure you stay tuned again to the Blue Horseshoe Pod on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. We have a lot of content coming your way here the next few days. So we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you watching and subscribing. And we'll talk to you. We'll definitely be back on Friday with some instant reaction to Bryce Young's comments as well. So make sure you're downloading and watching. We'll talk to you on Friday right here on the Blue Horseshoe Pod.